All right, and everyone can see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Great. All right, well, thanks for joining for this KalaWorkshop for kind of some Agile and Scrum intros. I have pulled up a JIRA board that is showing us what we're going to cover today. What I'm going to ask for you all is a little bit of participation as we work through each of the epics. I'm going to ask for you to participate in our definition of done by just giving me a yay or nay in the chat, or if you want to verbalize, you're welcome to do that as well, especially if you have a question and want us to answer it. Call something out in vocally if you don't mind. All right, I have the chat pulled up as well. So let's get started. So we're gonna start our sprint today and move forward. So wanted to start the conversation by reminding us a little bit of our values that we've recently formulated here at Kalamuna. You'll see that I've put them here on the issue: act with integrity, create, honor process, results matter, and work independently but in sync. So I think you'll see as we work through this that it makes sense that we at Kalamuna use the Scrum process to manage our projects because they harken back to these values. So just wanted to remind everyone a little bit of that. All right, we're gonna start with a little bit of an Agile overview. So what is Agile itself? It's a methodology of work that allows for empiricism and flexibility. I always see that word empiricism and it's like a big word that I always feel like I should know, but I don't want to ask because I want to sound like I know what I'm talking about. But it's really like going back to the middle school days of your scientific science classes where you're doing an experiment and you're learning from that experiment. It's using your sentences, using that scientific approach, and really inspecting and adapting to move things along. So this way of thinking about projects started back in the 70s, maybe even before then if you are doing some research back in the 50s and 60s. But it really became popularized in 2001 after a meeting of the minds in Utah when they were discussing some lightweight development methods, and they came up with this Agile Manifesto at that summit. So this is a website that exists that you can go to read through the manifesto itself and get a little bit more information about it. But it basically dictates, what the Agile methodology needs to remember. So it's putting individuals and interactions over the processes and the tools. It's really valuing working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change, which I think is the most important one, over following a set plan of attack. And a lot of people get confused with this because they think this means, oh, we don't have to document anything, we don't have to plan anything, we don't have to have any contracts. And that's not what Agile is all about. It's just saying that the items on the left that are in bold here are where we need to put our focus and being able to be adaptive and flexible and respond to that change as we move forward. There are several principles that are also talked about here on in the Agile Manifesto site. I'm not going to read them all to you. Feel free to dig into them. There are links that will be provided after this. But it basically just goes into more detail about some of those main values. Something else to consider is that Agile is kind of this umbrella term that can be used to apply to several different types of work, of the way to work. So you'll see here that Scrum falls under that umbrella along with Kanban, lean software development, and other, maybe less well-known ways of working through project management. All right, so that is our first epic. So please let me know if you all feel comfortable and we can move on and you are agreeing that we're done. All right, I got a response from Grimmy. We're going to move these to done while everyone's getting in their comments. Any questions, though? Epic was the Agile overview. All right, the next one we're going to go through is the Scrum Overview. So as I mentioned, Scrum is a way of practicing an Agile methodology. It's a framework for getting work accomplished. It's really best suited for complex projects. So projects where you have a lot of stakeholders, where there's changing business and technology landscapes, where you have unknown requirements and unknown technology that you want to use, where you're doing a lot of systems integrations, you know, when you're working with customers or people. Those are all things that could add to the complexity of a project. So right here, as you'll see in the chart, this is where complex projects kind of fall, where the requirements are far from agreement and the technology is far from certain. So this might sound familiar. The kinds of projects that we work on are very typically complex projects. So again, another reason why Scrum makes a lot of sense for us. Scrum is iterative and incremental, meaning that we're always, you know, improving on the work that we're doing, and we're taking chunks of the project and moving things forward. There are three main pillars of Scrum, and these are inspection, adaptation, and transparency. So we're really, you know, reinforcing that aspect that we want to look and use the scientific method to inspect the work that we're doing and the plan that we have in place. We want to allow for adaptation as we're moving things along, and we want to maintain transparency so that you know, all team members are aware of what's going on in the project at all times. All right, so Scrum has some values that have been set forth by people like Jeff Sutherland and others that have you know, been promoting the Scrum approach and developing it over the years. These are commitment, so committing to a goal, having focus on your job and your commitment, being open, again, that transparency, keeping everything about the project visible, respect, acknowledging that our team members are shaped by their experiences and their backgrounds, and we should respect that. And then courage, really having the courage as a team member to make that commitment, to move forward and act, to be open, and to expect the respect from your other team members. So we're going to dig into some of the more specifics about Scrum, but in terms of the overview, can we consider this done?
Yep.
Taking your word for it, Larkin. All right, so our next epic we're going to run through is the different roles that are included within Scrum. So the first role is the team. The team is responsible for delivering the potentially shippable increments of work by the end of each sprint. So they are the ones that are doing the work. Teams are typically comprised of 3 to 9 people. They are self-organizing, meaning that, you know, they're kind of coming together themselves and organizing themselves in who needs to work on a project typically. They're cross-functional. We'll get into that a little bit with a story, but this means that, you know, you have everyone on the team and all the skill sets needed to complete all the work in that sprint. They're collaborative, so it's very important to work well together. And overall, they should plan and manage their own work. So they really need to have ownership over what they're doing and when they're doing it, and especially how they're doing it. So here you'll see a little picture here. We have a potential Scrum team. We have the ninja, the baker, and the priest. So an example of why teams need to be cross-functional, this team was given a sprint goal of murdering Mr. X. And unfortunately, the ninja got sick. And the Scrum team decided that the ninja needed to take the day off and rest, but that the sprint needed to still continue. So the team was charged with figuring out who needed to proceed with the murder, and they decided that the baker should be the one to do that because he has the most experience with knives and maybe could even use that rolling pin. And then the rest of the sprint, the priest was going to be able to take up over cooking the bread because he has a little bit of knowledge, you know, and some experience with bread. So that's just a short example with a link to some others on why teams need to be cross-functional, because we need to plan for people getting sick, for things coming up, and for needing to adjust and you know, be flexible with our plans. So the next role is the product owner. So this is the person that is responsible for the product that we are shipping or delivering. So this person needs to share the product vision, the project vision with the team. They are responsible for prioritizing the features based on things like the business cares about. So the return on the investment, the market value, you know, what the users are saying. They really need to understand the customers and the users. They're responsible for creating and refining the product backlog, which we'll get into in a moment. They need to collaborate with the team. This is really important. They need to make sure that, you know, their vision and mission for the project is understood by the team. They also have the responsibility of accepting and rejecting the deliverables that come out of the sprint. And they need to be really decisive and be willing to say no and make decisions. They are the conduit between the business and the Scrum team, and they need to have a really good working relationship with stakeholders to make sure that the project can move forward. The last role on the Scrum team is the Scrum Master. This person is responsible for delivering a really high-performing and learning team. So they are often seen as the servant leader to the product owner and the team, making sure that they're removing any barriers to work, anything that could come up to stop the sprint goal from being accomplished. Their authority is kind of indirect. They don't directly manage anyone or have any control over the outcomes of the project or the people themselves. So it's really important this person enables cooperation so that the whole team can work together towards success. They're seen as a facilitator, and they really want to focus on the team being successful. The nature of the engagement of the Scrum Master can change over time. So at the beginning of a project or at the beginning of you know, a team forming together, some people, the forming, norming, and storming aspects of teamwork. So when the team is initially forming, the Scrum Master might have a lot of, you know, more prescriptive direction and help with the team. But as the team matures and progresses, the Scrum Master can kind of step back and let the team be a little bit more responsible and hold each other accountable for things. So that's a good thing. So those are the 3 roles that are present on a Scrum team. Very important. Does everyone agree that we can move forward?
I have a question, Kristin.
Yeah.
Looking at the product owner and the Scrum Master, it seems like there's a little bit of maybe overlap in terms of accountability, but I'm wondering if you could explain how those 2 roles are different in the sense of like, well, who's responsible for keeping the project on time and on budget, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So Scrum is a little bit, has some different, you know, ideas about on time and on budget because things are a little bit flexible and adaptable. So this is one of the ways that Scrum, we have to adapt Scrum as we're working in our world to align more closely with timeline and budget. So I think overall it would be kind of a shared responsibility, but I think in terms of the high-performing team, the Scrum Master should be reminding the person of those metrics that we're trying to hit, and then the product owner should be working with the business side to make sure that we have what we need in terms of the time and budget allotted.
Great, thanks. And as
quick follow-up.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
maybe you were going to ask the next question. Go ahead.
Quick follow-up-ish question then, and we can, maybe this will come to this later, and it's not the right time, so I don't want to derail the presentation. But are there like strategies for, are there like documented strategies or like established documented processes that people use to mitigate that whole, like when working on, you know, when you have like a fixed budget and or timeline, either or both, some of those ideas of like the kind of, you know, we deal with it a week at a time, and we're really flexible with estimation, and we're really flexible with what it means to be done and all those things. Are there like schools of thought on that matter that are well fleshed out at this point?
There's definitely different ways of approaching this, especially when you're adapting Scrum to work in more of an agency space. I can provide some things that I look to, you know, thoughts and ideas, but I don't know if anyone has it 100% nailed down as to the best approach.
No one's written the book with like the 3 options or whatever.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
I mean, I guess it all depends too on the project, the teams, and the client itself.
I have a question, Kristin. Mm-hmm. I know when we are dealing with clients, they occasionally have product owners on their side as well. Are we differentiating between our product owners and their product owners? Are we just talking about that as a collective whole, or what's the differentiation there?
Yeah, great question. So again, a lot of the things that I read and have you know, found out about adapting Scrum to agency work is that it's great to have a product owner be on the client side to be able to, you know, own that process and really be the conduit between the Scrum team and the business. But it doesn't always work that way. So that's one of those compromises that we sometimes have to make to in the way that we work to really support the product owner that is designated on the client side to make sure that they are empowered to move forward and have some of the skills. I've even heard of agencies like literally having the client attend product owner training so that they have some of the skills and background and knowledge on larger projects to be able to fill those shoes. So it's definitely a conversation in the digital project management space.
Got it. Thank you.
Great. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. I think these are great conversations and questions, and we'll have some time at the end to address more stuff. So thank you. All right, so the next epic we're going to chat through is artifacts. There are several artifacts that are included in Scrum. The first is the product backlog. So this is owned by the product owner itself, but anyone can contribute to the product backlog at any time. Items in the backlog should be deep, so they should be detailed appropriately. They should be emerging, you know, continuously being added to and updated. They should be estimated by the team eventually and prioritized as well. So another way of thinking of this is Devo. They should have a description, an estimate, a value, and an order. So the product backlog eventually turns into the sprint backlog in a ceremony called sprint planning, which we'll get to in a second. These things are all intertwined. The Scrum team itself owns the sprint backlog. These are the things that are pulled into the sprint during sprint planning. And these tasks should be even more detailed. They should be, you know, ready for development, that anyone should be able to pull them and start working on them. So they need to be really specific. They need to be measurable, achievable within the sprint timeline, and also relevant to the sprint goal and time box so that we know, you know, how much time and effort we should be spending on this issue. And we talked about this briefly, but the definition of done is another artifact of Scrum. So each Scrum team should have its own definition of done. This is also called a consistent acceptance criteria that would be fitting across all user stories. So this really drives the quality of work and ensures that we're able to assess when a story is completed. There are different ways of thinking of this. In software development, this might mean that things are coded, reviewed, they've gone through automated testing, we've integrated it with all of our other systems, and we've documented it. And that's our stamp that this issue is completed and done. But in a services context, it might look a little bit different. Did we complete every task that's under this particular user story? Did we attach all of the deliverables and work to the user story itself so that the product owner can review it and make sure that it meets expectations? So there's a little bit of differentiating depending on the type of work that's getting done and what that definition of done might mean. So those are the various artifacts that come out of working in a sprint framework. Any questions? All right. Kristin, did you have something?
I was going to ask a question, but we've only got 8 minutes left, and it could probably take 15 minutes to answer, which was, what's a user story?
That is a good question. I can provide some information after that. Okay. So our last and final epic is meetings or ceremonies, as they're sometimes called in Scrum. So there are, various meetings here to pull through. So the first one is sprint planning. It's the first meeting that takes place in a sprint. And the purpose is for the Scrum team to figure out what they want to do in the sprint and then figure out how they want to accomplish that. There is a set time period or time frame that should be used for this meeting. It's 8 hours for a 1 month sprint. A lot of times our sprints are 2 weeks, so that would be 4 hours, and we shouldn't be exceeding that time frame. That this is kind of one of those things that is taught in Scrum, but of course we can be flexible, but it shouldn't be taking you longer than that. So, be efficient and come to the table with the things that you need. So speaking of the things that you need to have ready for this meeting, there should be an ordered product backlog that the product owner is responsible for ordering. We should have the team's capacity for work during the intended sprint time frame. We should be looking at the team's historical velocity. So again, this is something that can get calculated as a team works together. Historically, we can see how much work was able to be accomplished in a sprint, and then we can use that to determine how much work we should be planning for the next sprints. The product owner might also have a sprint goal in mind as they come to the table for the sprint planning meeting. So following this meeting, we should have some outputs. Those are the formalized sprint goal that everyone has agreed to, the plan for how the work will get done, and a forecast of what the potentially shippable product and work will be by the end of the sprint. So everyone should understand what they need to be taking on. Another meeting that takes place in Scrum is the daily Scrum. So ideally, if you're working on one product or one project, you would be meeting with your team daily to have this meeting. And the purpose is to really sync up and to plan the work for the day so that the team can make as much progress as possible towards completing the sprint goal. This meeting should take no longer than 15 minutes. And you should come to the table with, the forecast for the sprint, your plan from the previous day, and any updates from the various team members. And after the meeting, you should have a plan for that day or the next time frame before you meet, and a list of any impediments that the Scrum Master needs to be trying to remove those blockers for you. So there are a couple of questions, a couple of different ways that these meetings can be formulated, but ideally we want to get each team member to contribute by answering these 4 questions. What have you done since the last time we met to help the team meet its commitment for the sprint? What will you do before we meet again that will help the team meet the commitment for the sprint? What impediments you have that might be keeping you from helping the team meet the commitment for the sprint? And are we going to meet the sprint goal? So those are really, well formulated, well thought out questions that can really get us to the heart of the matter, the commitment for the sprint, the goal overall. So we have this breakdown of work in the issues, but we really want to focus on the goal and making sure that we can meet the goal, and we might need to adapt and rethink our plan, be flexible as we move through. So backlog refinement is another quote-unquote meeting that needs to happen during a sprint. The team itself should be spending about up to 10% of their time helping the product owner refine the backlog. It's important to not spend more time than the 10% because things are going to change. So we don't want to spend too much time refining the backlog if this issue might not even come to light as we move down the product and project. It's not a formal sprint ceremony, and it can happen at any time in the sprint, but it's just important that it happens so that we can keep that planning and keep the project moving forward. The sprint review, also called the demo. So this is the second to last thing in the sprint. The purpose is to be able to inspect and adapt with various stakeholders so that the Scrum team can present potentially shippable values increments of work and get feedback. So it's also a good idea and a good time to review general business practice things and to start reviewing the plan for the next sprint. So while you have some of those stakeholders in the room, start talking about the things that you're going to be doing next so that they have some insight there. Again, there's a set duration of 4 hours for a 1-month sprint or 2 hours for a 2-week sprint. So it's a little bit of a longer meeting, but don't exceed that time because basically if you are, you should be striving to move things along and improve your process there. So some inputs that should be brought to the table for this meeting are the forecast for the sprint, the work that you're reviewing with the stakeholders, an explanation for any sort of unfinished work, and a good reminder of what the definition of done is for the Scrum team so that everyone is clear on what is done, what is not done. And then, of course, outputs include feedback from the stakeholders and potentially new product backlog items that need to be added. The last meeting in a sprint is the sprint retrospective. The purpose of this meeting is for the Scrum team itself to come together to inspect and adapt on how they are working together and to come up with a plan for change for the next sprint. This meeting has a set expected duration of 3 hours for a 1-month sprint, so 1.5 hours for a 2-week sprint. You should come to the table with a forecast for the sprint, the observations about how the team is working together, the plan that you have from your previous retrospective, and your definition of done. So coming out of this meeting, you might have a plan for what you should change in the next sprint and any sort of updates to that definition of done that need to take place so that you can more fully realize your sprint issues and sprint goals. There's lots of different ways to run a retrospective, and I've included some links here to some resources. It's definitely a super important part of Scrum. In fact, the Scrum trainer told me that if you aren't doing a retrospective, then you're not doing Scrum at all. So it's interesting to think of different ways to mix up your retrospectives and get different feedback from your various Scrum team members. And we're a minute over, so I won't spend too much time working through this, but I have a short retrospective form that I'm going to send out to everybody. So feel free to participate in that, ask questions, and I'll get back to you and share the results. Thank you, everyone.